Hey everyone, this is my YouTube channel, The Biracial Project, and today we're talking about the experience of Asian Americans, and joining me for the conversation is my friend Gabe Seying. Gabe is from Indianapolis, but he's based in Cincinnati, Ohio right now. Is that right, Gabe?
Yeah, that's correct.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining our conversation today.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me. Thanks for
Yeah.
asking.
hmm So do you want to talk about where you are in life right now?
Yeah, so what I'm doing right now is I'm originally from Indianapolis, but I currently am going to law school at the University of Cincinnati. So living in the Cincinnati area right now, and then I'm about to graduate this year. So then after that, I'll be looking for jobs and working as an attorney or something in that capacity.
Awesome. That's exciting. Congrats to you for finishing 3 years of law school and good luck on your this coming year.
Yeah, thanks.
So I was kind of thinking back to the first time I met you, and I think one of the first conversations we had was when I came back from South Korea and we were talking about like experiences abroad. And I remember you talking about you had just spent a year in China, I think, as a student. And then for like in some way we made a connection that we were both biracial and we were talking about like biracial experience and stuff like that. So do you want to talk about what your ethnicity is and what it was like growing up biracial for you?
Yeah. So so like ethnically, my father is um so I'm like half Asian, half white. My father is ethnically Hmong, which is an ethnic group from Southeast Asia. He was born in Laos, and then his family immigrated here when he was a young kid to Indiana. My mother, she's white. Her family's ancestry is mostly German. So her grandparents are from Germany. So like her dad spoke like my grandpa spoke German. Her great grandparents, a lot of people on that side spoke German and stuff too. So ethnically speaking, like primarily like Hmong on my father's side, and then German on my mother's side. Yeah, and then my mom's from Northern Illinois, a small town like south of Chicago. My dad grew up mainly in Indianapolis, and then I grew up in the Indianapolis area also.
Okay. So for people who don't know what Hmong is or like what that people group is, how would you explain that to someone who's never heard of it before?
Yeah, so I mean, it's kind of like not as easy of one because the Hmong people, we don't really have our own country. We're an ethnic group that lives or like a separate ethnic group, East Asian ethnic group, Southeast Asian, that have our own language and culture, traditional clothing styles and customs. The Hmong people are originally from China, but they kind of like migrated through Southeast Asia to countries like Burma, Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. And then, so primarily, like largest Hmong population lives in China. After that would be like Southeast Asia, and then yeah. So then that's kind of a general like background of where they're from. But like we don't have our own country. We're like separate language, culture than our like surrounding neighbors, but we live inside other countries. Mhm.
Awesome. Okay. Is there a certain part of the US where there's more Hmong people than others?
Yeah. So in the US, the largest Hmong populations are in California and in the Twin Cities in Minnesota.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how often do you come across someone who like shares your ethnicity?
Like, well, now in like, so I'm in Cincinnati now, which is like Southern Ohio, on the border with Kentucky. And here, pretty much, actually, here, never. I've never come across another Hmong person in this area. Back home in Indy, I kind of did, but that was partial, not necessarily all family relations, but just by growing up there, you know who's who, sort of. And then, generally speaking, in the Midwest, not a lot. The like Hmong population is pretty small in the countries that Hmong people come from, and then in the U.S. it's even smaller. And then a percentage of the Asian American population, it's pretty small.
Uh-huh. Okay. I remember talking about race and ethnicity with you a few years back, and I remember asking, like, which side of your ethnicity do you relate to more or you identify with more? And I think you said something to the effect that, like, when you're with Asians, you might feel more white, and when you're with white people, you might feel more Asian. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I think when you grow up in a multi-ethnic family or home, and around two different communities, you kind of take on like like in my case, I think you physically, take on like physical traits and characteristics of like the two groups. And then also like culturally, you have like influences from like two different cultures. And so I think that when you're with, one side versus the other, the characteristics that you learn that are really different, the differences like show up like easier or are more apparent. And so I think that's definitely something, when I'm with like a group of Asian people or Hmong people, I realize the parts of the culture or like physical traits or whatever that I'm lacking, compared to everyone else. And then like vice versa, when I'm with like all white people or like white Americans, I realize how much more Asian, quote unquote Asian I am than everyone else.
Interesting. So when you were growing up, do you feel like you had a lot of Asian friends, or what ethnicity was like your majority friend group?
Yeah, so I grew up in Indianapolis and I went to private school, like private Christian school, and it was overwhelmingly white. Most of the community I was in was overwhelmingly white. However, I lived for a long time actually with my parents and my grandparents and my aunt. Like we all lived together. And so, at home was much more culturally, I guess you could say, like Asian, more Hmong. And then like when I would go out to school, it was like very more white for sure. Uh, the other thing is kind of moving forward in that in my high school, the only substantial ethnic minority group at my high school were Asians. And so I did have like a few Asian friends in high school, but overwhelmingly my friends and like just my community that I was in was white.
Okay. Do you feel like your surroundings shaped your racial identity, or like how you identified racially?
I think so. I think in my case, in my own personal experience, I definitely was aware growing up in a very like white corner of Indiana. I was definitely made aware by other people and just, how I felt myself that I was Asian American, that I did look different. And I think at a young age, I felt more Asian because of that, because that was always the character trait that was pointed out to me by other people. And so I think that's just how I was like I was Asian passing in society in my community, and I think that made me feel more Asian. And then, as we were talking about before about identifying more with one side versus the other, depending on what community you're in, I think as I got older and I ended up living abroad and traveling and like having more diverse friends, and then I think that's when I started to feel more white, if that makes any sense. Because that's when I was in a group of people that were more attentive to like that side. Whereas growing up in a white community, they were like, oh, like you're Asian, you're the Asian one.
That's so interesting. I feel like that may, I don't know, was that like confusing at all once you got older and spent time with that Asian community that you may have thought you identified with or thought you related to more?
I think it like being young, it was a little bit difficult to process, I think, but part of that was really, I think, also like the community I was in wasn't equipped and didn't know how to handle, in a sense, I guess, diversity or be attentive to those, needs or concerns. And so I think I had to do a lot of processing and like sorting through stuff on my own. Whereas like later on in like college and stuff, I was able to have, groups of friends and education that helped, I guess, better shape my understanding of like race and identity and stuff like that. Yeah, I don't know if I quite answered your question,
No,
but
that, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I remember, I think you were involved with like a lot of student-led societies on campus. So how did that play into like the culture or race that you began to identify with as an adult?
yeah, I think so. In undergrad, I was on the executive board of the Asian Student Union at IUPUI. Part of, why I did that was when you come to college and you're in a new environment, you kind of try to find like your community and your group. And initially I just saw that as like finding people that were, more similar to me and people that I could relate to. Because I definitely did feel like I could identify with a lot of what the people in that organization did. And in addition to that, like as part of the organization, that was a really large part of what we did is we did a lot of workshops, talks surrounding, concepts of race, identity, representation in society and on campus. And so I think in a way for me, it was to find community, but then a lot of what we did was in a sense like cathartic, I guess, also for me personally, is just like talking about a lot of these, issues surrounding like immigration, race, ethnic identity, stuff like that. And then kind of at the same time for me internally processing, where do I stand, in this, cultural mix in the States.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you feel like you have the experience or like the platform to speak on issues that Asian Americans or Asians in general deal with?
I think with regard to a lot of topics, but it depends because everyone has like the Asian American community is like pretty large and diverse, and there's a lot of different situations and experiences people have, and so I think even for someone who grew up multi-ethnic and like biracial in the community, um, growing up, I think I personally did have a lot of experiences that tie me to a lot of like common shared experiences of the like broader Asian American community. Like for instance, like growing up in a household with a family that are immigrants to this country, dealing with language barrier and sharp cultural differences. And then also I have spent time abroad in East Asia. And so I think that also has given me, I don't know, just kind of a better understanding and kind of shaped my experience and understanding of how the situations work. But then, I still, I was born and raised here. Like, so I, for example, don't have the exact experience of someone who did come here as an immigrant or who did come here as like, an exchange student and has to deal with, a whole other set of issues or processing. So I think I can speak into a lot of topics and a lot of issues, and I have this understanding and experience of it. But then I definitely am aware that there's definitely a lot of things that I haven't experienced and that I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to make about how big and diverse the Asian community is. I think a lot of times the majority group might like lump all Asians into like one pot and kind of put all stereotypes together with them. But to understand like how diverse they are and how the experience of someone who comes here, like you said, as an exchange student is going to be a lot different than someone who grew up here, even if they weren't biracial, but they lived like somewhat of an Asian experience in the US is going to be so much different than like the immigrant experience. But at the same time, I think when the majority culture perceives those individuals as the same person, they could have some type of shared experience as to like how, I don't know, like how they're perceived by the general public.
Yeah, and another example is, like, for instance, being Hmong. My family came to the States as refugees after the Vietnam War. And so, that section of the Asian American community that has come here as like refugees as a result of war, the reasoning for why a lot of us came to this country is really different than like other sections of the Asian American community, which came here, based on like academics or like job opportunity. Like my grandparents didn't come here to look for jobs and stuff. It's because they just didn't have any other option but to come here. So yeah, so even like that, I guess, is like a different kind of lived experience that isn't the same in every community.
Yeah, that's so true. Like there's one group they're like running from war and they're like looking for a place to survive and build a life. And then there's the other group who are like looking for opportunity and so they come here for education or like yeah, maybe freedom from government and that type of stuff. So yeah, what are the visible differences that you've seen from like families who have refugee parents versus families who like came here just for like education or opportunity?
Yeah, I think some of the differences could include, like, for instance, well, I think one that kind of comes to the top of my head is like wealth or like class, I guess. A lot of people and refugees from, say, like Laos, where my family came from, were from lower income families in their respective countries, and they were, people were like farmers or not high earning, not highly educated people, and then they left because of war and genocide, and they came to the United States to escape that. And there's other sections of the Asian community which came here for like academic opportunity. They were able to secure employment or jobs through, education or other things, and they came here because they thought they saw economic opportunity, or maybe they had political reasons and they had different opportunity. But then I think the big difference is kind of the starting point is because some people came here, with a little bit more education and a little bit more support. And then there are other parts of the Asian American community that came here, not with much, and started at had a different starting point and different reasons for starting at that starting point here in the US. I guess, I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, I think that would also influence the children of those individuals. Like depending on where they start, they might raise their children differently on like what their drive is in life and like what opportunities they should seek and like the values that they hold as well. So, how early do you think that you began to like recognize race and ethnicity? I kind of asked this question to other people on the series, like your earliest race-related memory or something like that.
Uh, Earliest memory, a really early memory, I guess, the schools I grew up in, a lot of the other students definitely pointed out like race and ethnicity. Like if you weren't white, they definitely made would ask questions all the time or just say something dumb and stupid, And so, I don't know, it's probably like preschool, like kindergarten. I definitely remember that, like a really early memory in like preschool. I don't know if it's preschool. This is really early, but having a conversation with a classmate about like a favorite food or something, and they were saying like beef and noodles or something. I don't remember who was saying, but basically, he was talking about some sort of pasta thing that you just buy in like some sort of like rice roni box or some instant food or something. And I was totally misinterpreting it as like pho, which is like a Vietnamese Southeast Asian dish with like, it's like a noodle soup with beef and rice noodles in it. And in my head, I was just thinking this. And then as we were talking, I was like, oh, we're not talking about the same thing at all. And then also like, he had no idea what I was talking about. Like, and I was like, oh, like we have like totally different ideas of what some of the food is that we eat. That was like an early memory of being like, oh, like, we're different. But yeah, I don't know. It's pretty early.
That's crazy. Even in preschool, like that's how your outlook on like race or a different culture can be shaped at that early of an age. And I think food is a really good example too, because food is a huge part of a culture. And so in order to like identify with people, a lot of times you like talk about food similarities, but like one of the huge dividing factors in culture is food. And as a child too, when you're growing up, like in my family, we ate a lot of rice and beans all the time. And like no matter what we were eating, there was always like a rice cooker, and rice was like it didn't matter what the meal was, we just always ate rice with it. And when I had friends over, I remember realizing like that wasn't a normal thing to have rice with every meal, and most families maybe just have like bread or potatoes with meals instead of rice. So yeah.
Yeah, I remember being like thinking when I would spend time at like friends' houses, I was like, what do people even eat as a side if they don't have rice with their meal? I was like, what do you have? Like, are you just eating like sausage and a steak? Like, what do you even eat with it?
Yeah, like where's the carbohydrate in this meal?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about being a person of color in law school. How has that been for you? Have you felt, I mean, so you've been through undergrad, you were involved with Asian activities and stuff like that, but I think higher education or like, yeah, law school, grad school, stuff like that, you're more developed as a person by the time you get to that stage of life. So what has that been like for you?
Um, it hasn't been that bad with regards to like race or identity and things like that. I think, like you said, you as a person, you're just like much more into yourself and like more aware of how you are and how things work. My experience has been fairly positive. I actually continued into organizations, and I was like the president of the Asian Law Student Association last year. And so I kind of continued with similar things as I'd done in the past, just in like the legal field, so to say. But yeah, it's definitely like graduate school is different. For me, it was definitely a lot wider. Law school in the Midwest is very, very white. There's also not a lot of Asian Americans or just Asian people at all in law school. So for being part of Asian interest organization in law school. It was just, one of our biggest issues was just getting bodies, just having enough people to do things, because we just didn't have, there's just not a lot of Asian law students, in Cincinnati or really in the Midwest, I guess. If you go out to the coast, it's really different. But, here in the Midwest, it's like, there's just not a lot of other people that look like you in law. So that part hasn't necessarily been that hard, but it's definitely something you notice. Yeah.
Yeah. So as a law student, all this racial injustice that's going on right now and like racial unrest, even in the workplace, people are talking about discrimination a lot more often. And they're looking to like laws and policies to shape and to transform the racist culture and society that we live in. I wondered what your thoughts are on that and if those types of things ever come up in the classroom.
Yeah. Yeah. So they actually do come up in the classroom. Luckily, I have a lot of great professors who try to be attentive to what's going on in the world and in students' lives. So those questions definitely do come up. A lot of people for sure like want to have a positive impact and change on that. I think being in law school, you also realize, especially in law school, you really have a view into like the systematic kind of arguments and concepts surrounding racism in the US. So I think in law school, you can become a bit of a cynic too. I think that happens a lot. It's because we see a lot of negative things that happen in regards to like court cases, policies, things like that. And you see kind of the history too, which is fairly negative. But I mean, of course, there's good things that happen and good changes that happen, but then also you see a lot of negative. And I think in law school, that can be the hard part, is just like seeing all the negative stuff that happened in the past and that is still happening now, and kind of getting a little hopeless about how the situation is. But like definitely people do care about, I have plenty of classmates who want to have like a positive impact. And I think like law and policy is definitely, in a super important part of like making change and accommodation for people in this country. Is it the only thing? No, there's tons of cultural and like outside law and policy, outside the court, outside the legislative, like so many other aspects that kind of, I don't know how to explain, but like, influence society and how people live. And so like, that's like law and policy is huge for sure. But yeah.
So, like, if someone's watching this video and they're thinking about, like, yeah, law and policy is the answer, like, we need to get laws changed to, like, stop racial injustice and stuff like that. It sounds like you're saying part of the answer to the racial injustice and like problems in society that we have now do come from changing laws and policies, but there are other elements of like activism and working toward change that are totally outside of changing laws and policy. What
Yeah.
are those things? Like what would you point people to other than like let's go lobby for such and such change?
The first thing you can do is kind of try to educate yourself. Like it's just a small thing. Like you don't have to lobby necessarily initially, be a lobbyist or like someone fighting for policy, but like you can kind of just try to like learn yourself. Like, okay, like what is the history of race in America? Like what is the history of, like what's my own lived experience? Like what are things facing Asian Americans, or things facing, Black African Americans, or things facing, Native Indigenous peoples. And so I think like when you start to kind of just educate yourself and learn about the history, learn about current policies or whatever, or just like reading people's stories or hearing people's stories, I think that's a good starting point. It's just like you kind of educate yourself and learn a little bit. And then after that, I think you can maybe sort of move in the direction that suits you more, whether that's like you need to be a lawyer and you need to be fighting in civil rights cases, or maybe you're just like volunteering in an organization on the weekend, like I don't know, helping like kids of color and like mentoring like children of color or something. I don't know. Like so, there's like so many different areas I think that will impact society, and me personally, I always think in like a holistic way, in a macro level, holistic ways. Like there's just so many different things that will impact people's lived experiences in this country, and you can have an impact on that in so many different areas. And it doesn't have to just be law and policy. Yes, that's
Yeah. I feel like that's so good to say because a lot of like everybody's skilled in a different way and they may have passions or interests that are different. But if they identify that like racial injustice is an issue right now and that they want to get involved and figure out how to bring forth change, figuring out like where their skill set is and how that relates to the problem at hand. And like you said, they don't have to become a lawyer or go and lobby and whatnot, but to figure out what their skill set is and how that plays into the development and change of like a messed up society. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think a good starting point is just talking to like if you have friends, like talking to friends, like asking them what their experiences were, or like asking them for clarification on things you might not be super aware of. Or, of course, we all have like the internet and we can go online and read stories or look up certain things. I think that's a good starting point to like just kind of give you somewhere to be like, okay, like this is where people are coming from, or this is where I'm coming from. Or maybe you just talk to your own family and try to and learn about like your own past and your own, I guess, influences in your own life too. And so I think education in a kind of cliche way is like a good starting point, and listening to people. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. That's a good challenge for people. So my last question is kind of like, what do you know now about race and ethnicity that you wish you knew when you were younger? And this question is kind of like for people who are growing up biracial or multiracial, and maybe confused about their identity or trying to figure out like what resources are out there and like what groups are out there to help them navigate that experience.
Something I know now is that I don't have to have one thing I've become comfortable with is not having it 100% figured out, or needing to have a super concrete definition of like where I fit and how I fit. Because I think when you're multi-ethnic, like and when you're biracial, you're multi-ethnic, I think in a sense you do fit into like multiple roles and like quote unquote categories, right? And so it's not a one or the other thing. Sometimes it's both. And so I think being comfortable with that was something I wish I knew earlier, or was more comfortable with earlier, instead of being kind of like, oh, I need to like find myself. I need to like place myself in a specific box, to be happy or something. And I wish, yeah. And like, that's something I know now is like, you can kind of occupy multiple roles at the same time. Also now, I guess as a law student and like finishing undergrad and everything and stuff, is like, I just learned a lot more about this like systematic racism and like kind of just like built in issues that people of color and people who hold multiple ethnic identities will face, is because there's a lot of stuff that's just built into our laws, built into our systems and courts, but then also just that's intrinsic to culture too. Law school has helped me see kind of structurally how a lot of stuff happens.
Yeah, I think that's so important to realize because I think a lot of people will just say that society as a whole just kind of evolves and changes, and that's how like people are pitted against each other. But I think that the laws of a society actually play a huge part in that. And even though people might think that lawmakers are all wonderful people who make laws to benefit everyone, in reality, there is some agenda at hand that each lawmaker has, and people are flawed, and so that's going to
Yeah.
end up hurting one people group.
And another thing too that happens sometimes is like it's just as simple as like say like a judge just being ignorant. Like I've read and heard stories of people talking about major court cases or federal levels, court proceedings going on, and then like the judge just asking like, so what is this? There's someone making a decision on something that they don't really know or understand. And so some of it isn't even just, some of it is like actual like malice and intentional discrimination, but some of it is just some people come from different backgrounds and they're just completely clueless to another person's situation. And sometimes it wasn't necessarily intentional. It was just like the person making the decision just really had no idea, someone else's like lived experience. And so, yeah, sometimes it's just like actual ignorance. Yeah.
hmm I think that ties back so well to like your challenge for people to educate themselves, to talk to people of color, to like broaden even their like friend group and network of individuals who they interact with, so that they can be more knowledgeable about how certain decisions will impact a minority group or any type of people group. Well, we're going to wrap up, but thanks so much, Gabe, for joining our conversation. I really appreciate your perspective and your story.
Thank you. Thanks for asking me the questions. Thanks for reaching out. It's good to talk to you.
Yeah, you as well.